Timothy is the Duncan Chair in Constitutional Government at the Goldwater Institute. He is the author of several books, including The Right to Earn a Living, Economic Freedom and the Law, The Conscience of the Constitution, The Permission Society, and most recently, Frederick Douglass, Self-Made Man. He's completing a biography on Jacob Bronowski, and he has also written several excellent articles for the Objective Standard, most recently on Sequoia and the vital nature of the written word. I'm delighted to introduce Timothy Sandefur to speak on Frederick Douglass.
Thank you very much. I've written some things up here, but it's not really necessary that you write them down or anything. It just had to be a little helpful to keep an eye on things, because I don't presume that you know a great deal about Douglass, but you don't really have to, because I want to look at Douglass through the eyes of a philosopher rather than a biographer, and look at the lessons that he teaches us. Nobody in American history has a better claim to the title of self-made man than Frederick Douglass, who escaped from slavery to become one of the nation's greatest anti-slavery activists, and then a world-renowned author and orator, diplomat, and public intellectual. And most of you know the general outlines of his story, how he was born on a Maryland plantation in 1818, deprived of a family, sent at the age of 7 to Baltimore, where he was kept illiterate until he tricked the neighborhood boys into teaching him how to read and write. How he was brutalized by cruel slave masters and managed at last to flee on the Underground Railroad in 1838. And after that, he worked at a variety of jobs, from shipwright to pushing the bellows in a blacksmith shop, studying in his spare time, and gradually rose to fame as an author, lecturer, and diplomat. You all know his story because he wrote it himself in his famous autobiography. As a professional lecturer, Douglass made his living traveling and giving speeches, of which his most popular and most famous was entitled Self-Made Men, and I'm sure you all read it in the previous issue of the Objective Standard. The lecture celebrated heroic figures like Abraham Lincoln, who rose from obscurity through their own hard toil, as opposed to being fortunate enough to be born into wealth and fame. Douglass referred to, in his lecture, to engineers and poets and political revolutionaries and industrialists who, if they have climbed high, have built their own ladders. But Douglass's lecture was not just a series of biographies and famous rags to riches stories. Instead, it focuses on what he called the philosophy of the self-made man. What are the qualities and virtues that make for the self-made man? And what does this idea have to teach us about society in general? I want to focus on the principles that Douglass himself saw as underlying this process of self-creation, because for those of us interested in what it means to be a self, to honor and respect the self and understand its relation to the other selves around us, Douglass was in an especially strong position to teach us. He had been essentially forced to create a self. He knew how it was done and what it meant, and he set out to explain it not just in this lecture, but in many of his writings. The thesis of the Self-Made Men lecture was that the people that we view as self-made success stories have accomplished that status not through luck or accident or fate, but through, in his words, work, 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 work. He writes this. The first work appears with 1 exclamation point, the second with 2 exclamation points, the third with 3 exclamation points, and the fourth with 4 exclamation points, all in all caps. So he really meant it. Determined perseverance, an uncomplaining will to shoulder hard responsibility, and a commitment to do one's best were the keys. Note that unlike today's age of pseudo-inspiration, like posters that say, believe in the power of your dreams and such, Douglass never told his audience to believe in their dreams. In fact, he never uses the word dream. On the contrary, he would have regarded that as a dangerous invitation to passivity, to the idea that fate or some outside force will give us success if only we wait patiently and have faith. Nothing of that sort is to be found in Douglass's thought. In fact, it comes close to the notion that Douglass called the accident theory of the self-made man, and which he rejected. The accident theory, he said, divorces a man from his own achievements, contemplates him as a being of chance, and leaves him without will, motive, ambition, or aspiration. Now, certainly Douglass would have agreed that we must pursue our dreams, but he counsels us that dreaming is the easy part. The hard part, the really essential part, is work, 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 work. Now, the second thing to note about Douglass's work, work, work prescription is how self-regarding it is. Douglass's focus in his self-made man prescription is on ambition and aspiration, on a desire to build and create and accomplish, not to serve one's fellow man. An even more striking example of this is to be found in Douglass's writings during the Civil War, when he worked to enlist former slaves and freedmen into the United States Army. What's remarkable about his work as a recruitment officer is that he virtually never urged black Americans to join the military to serve their country. On the contrary, that idea would have struck him as absurd. Slaves owed nothing to their country, which had abused them in the worst imaginable way. Instead, his arguments for enlistment were rooted entirely in considerations of self-esteem. In an 1863 article entitled, "Why Should the Colored Man Enlist?" Douglass gave 9 answers. The first was, "You are a man, and whatever concerns man should interest you. He who looks upon a conflict between right and wrong and does not help the right against the wrong, despises and insults his own nature, and invites the contempt of all mankind." The second was that black Americans were Americans entitled to citizenship and to the honor of aiding in the defense of the land of your birth. An honor that had been denied them before, but which now was open to them. Claim that honor as your right, Douglass says. His third reason was that slavery's defenders were terrified of the idea of black soldiers. Find out what the slave owner does not want and give him plenty of it, he said. One very refreshing thing about Douglass, just pause for a second to say, one of the very refreshing thing about Douglass is his total rejection of the idea of nonviolence. Douglass famously supported John Brown, went to his grave thinking John Brown was one of the greatest Americans who ever lived, said that the way to make fewer slave catchers was to make a few dead slave catchers, and said that citizenship rested on the 3 boxes, the ballot box, the jury box, and the cartridge box. Now, the fourth reason why black Americans needed to serve in the army was to get guns in their hands and to use them to defend themselves. A day would come when they would be free, and they would need to be able to protect themselves against racist mobs bent on re-enslaving them. Enlist, therefore, that you may learn the art and assert the ability to defend yourselves and your race. That phrase, assert the ability, is a beautiful one, and I want you to keep that phrase in mind. Now, Douglass's fifth reason for joining the military was to stand as a refutation of the basic premises of slavery. Men sat down your submission to slavery and insult to a lack of manly courage, he wrote. You should disprove the slander and wipe out the reproach. The sixth reason, by fighting for the nation, black Americans would prove themselves entitled to equal treatment before the law. The seventh and most interesting reason was to recover your own self-respect. Speaking to freedmen, Douglass acknowledged that slavery had indeed left them psychologically scarred. You have, to some extent, rated your value by the estimate of your enemies, and hence have counted yourselves less than you are, he said. You owe it to yourself and to your race to rise from your social debasement and take your place a man among men. Depend on it, he said. The subjective effect of this one act of enlisting will be immense and highly beneficial. You will stand more erect, walk more assured, feel more at ease, and be less liable to insult than you ever were before. You will be defending your own liberty, honor, manhood, and self-respect. The eighth reason was to prevent the nation from backsliding from the Emancipation Proclamation, and the ninth reason was to set off a chain reaction whereby those who were still enslaved would also rise up against the masters. At no point did Douglass suggest that black Americans owed the nation a duty to fight on their battlefields. When Douglass biographer David Blight says that Douglass, quote, asked black men to offer their selfless blood for country, end quote, he says the opposite of the truth. It was the United States that owed it to black Americans to allow them to assert their ability by fighting for themselves. This concept, asserting one's ability by fighting for oneself, was central to Douglass's idea of the self-made man. He often made this point by telling the story of his fight with Edward Covey, the most famous incident in his life. As a teenager, Douglass had become increasingly resentful about being enslaved and began acting out toward his master, Thomas Auld, by refusing to call him master, stealing food from the pantry, and so forth. So Auld sent him to Covey, who ran a sort of torture regimen to destroy slaves' sense of independence for a little extra money on the side. For 6 months, Douglass was beaten for infractions real or imagined. He was assigned to tasks that he did not know how to complete and then punished for failing to do them. Covey would spy on him and leap out at him at random times and attack him with a club for no reason. All of this was designed to break Douglass's spirit and his sense of self, to drill into him a sense of paranoia so that he would always feel that he was being watched and liable to be brutalized without warning. And Douglass tells us that it worked. After half a year of such treatment, his capacity for thought was extinguished. He ceased to read, to dream, or to imagine himself as a free person. "Behold a man transformed into a brute," he said. Exactly a century later, communist and fascist governments would employ similar tactics on a mass-produced scale to create the re-education and extermination camps that we are so familiar with. The goal of these places, wrote the philosopher Hannah Arendt, was to exterminate psyche, character, and individuality, and to transform people into a bundle of reactions. The end result of the totalitarian labor camp, she wrote, is men who can no longer be psychologically understood, whose return to the psychologically or otherwise intelligibly human closely resembles the resurrection of Lazarus. Douglass himself went through such a Lazarus moment. One August day, he suffered a heat stroke while laboring in the field, and Covey's response was to hit him on the head with a hickory stick. Douglass managed somehow to rise to his feet and stagger 2 miles through the forest to the home of his owner, Thomas Auld. He begged him for help. In this moment, the deepest point of despair in his life, Auld was deaf to his pleas and ordered Douglass to return to Covey's farm. During his walk back, Douglass decided that he would fight for himself. "Whence came the daring spirit," he wrote, "I do not know. But for 2 hours, he and Covey fought with their fists. The result was a stalemate. Covey stumbled away muttering to himself, and Douglass realized the truth of a principle that he later put into the words of the poet Byron, "Who would be free must himself strike the blow." Douglass had asserted his ability in an especially dramatic way. Now, this is the most famous incident in Douglass's life because he used it repeatedly to make the point that being a free person requires a willingness to stand up for oneself. He used particularly strong words to put this point in 1858 when he said, "I hold that next to the dignity of being a free man is the dignity of striving to be free. I detest the slaveholder and almost equally detest a contented slave. They are both enemies to freedom. One of the saddest facts connected with organized and settled oppression is that it deadens the sensibility of its victims. It acts upon the oppressed like certain deadly poisons upon animal life, which lull to sleep before dissolving in death." Slave masters sought to deaden the spirit by keeping slaves illiterate, depriving them of education and opportunity, of private property, of family life, of the chance to travel or express themselves, of the chance to assert their abilities, all with the aim of deadening the slave's sensibilities and killing their inner longing for freedom. But Douglass also described how this drive to assert one's ability applies in other, gentler contexts. And one of the most interesting comes from his fascination with the then new science of photography. Douglass loved having his picture taken. I mean, wouldn't you look at that? That's a good-looking guy there. Nobody has a scowl like Frederick Douglass. Actually, when he was a young boy, he got in a fight with some other boys on the plantation. They hit him in the head with a rock, and he got this scar right on the top of his nose, which is why he's got that permanent scowl. Douglass loved having his picture taken. He was the most photographed American of the 19th century. He took an average of 4 portraits throughout his life, per year, I mean. He also delivered lectures on picture making, in which he addressed the same themes as his Self-Made Man lecture. There was a sense, he said, in which making pictures was the most basic aspect of what it means to be human. Picture making, quote, is the process by which man is able to posit his own subjective nature outside of himself, so that it becomes the subject of distinct observation and contemplation. When we make pictures, we make an abstract ideal concrete. Happiness results less from external conditions than from internal exercises, he said. And one way we engage in that internal exercise of imagining a better world and a better self is by making pictures. Art is a special revelation of the higher powers of the human soul, he said. And this is a complicated passage, so I want to read it carefully. There is, in the contemplation of art, an unconscious comparison constantly going on in the mind of the pure forms of beauty and excellence which are without to those which are within and native to the human heart. It is a process of soul-awakening self-revelation, a species of new birth, for a new life springs up in the soul with every newly discovered agency by which the soul is brought into a more intimate knowledge of its own divine powers and perfections and is lifted to a higher level of wisdom, goodness, and joy. To put it more simply, art is both an expression of ideals and a means by which we can contemplate those ideals more objectively. It serves as a kind of spiritual fuel that gives us the strength and inspiration to assert our abilities. But it also helps us to define ourselves by better comparing ourselves to those ideals. Making art plays a role in self-creation and self-definition. So Douglass's idea of self-making has an aesthetic quality to it. The self-made man is like an artist who sculpts his life and his actions to create and reflect his model of the ideal. Now, another thinker who talked about this idea in similar terms was Aristotle. And Professor Biondi has described Aristotle's marvelous concept of the megalopsukos, so I won't get into that here, except to say that it parallels Douglass's life most remarkably. Perhaps the most striking is Aristotle's statement that the great-souled man must be unable to make his life revolve around another, for this is slavish. But there's no evidence that Douglass read Aristotle. More likely, he found this image of a personal ideal in the romantic literature of his day. He loved Victor Hugo and Alexandre Dumas. His favorite novel was The Count of Monte Cristo. And in these books, he found literary heroes who reflected a very similar image of the proud and efficacious ideal of the person who takes pleasure in asserting his abilities. And what those authors did, and what Douglass did himself when writing his memoirs, was to create in a literary character a representation of an abstract ideal, just as picture makers do. So much for making a self. What about others? If we shape our own lives in this way by asserting our abilities, what is the proper way of treating and regarding other people? Douglass and his admirers have been criticized for their emphasis on the self-regarding nature of the notion of work, work, work. Earlier this year, I took some heat for titling my book Douglass, Self-Made Man. Yale University professor David Blight wrote in the New York Times that it was inaccurate for me to call Douglass self-made because, quote, without many people, especially women, as well as male mentors, both white and black, he would not have survived and become Douglass. Of course, that's true. And Douglass said so in the Self-Made Men lecture when he said, quote, properly speaking, there are in the world no such things as self-made men. We have reaped where others have sown, and that which others have strewn, we have gathered. Obviously, Douglass, who detailed at great length in his autobiography the help others gave him, from his mother to his Baltimore playmates who taught him to read, to those who helped him escape from slavery, obviously he did not mean to deny that we get help from family and friends and teachers and others. And obviously he did not mean to deny the great benefits of helping others, whether it be in an emergency or just because we want to share. Douglass ran a station on the Underground Railroad and helped 400 or so slaves escape to freedom in Canada. And just as obviously, none of this undermines the idea of the self-made man. Indeed, this is so obvious that one suspects a different motive behind those who resist the term self-made as applied to Frederick Douglass. In fact, one can sort of detect the notion that President Barack Obama expressed in his infamous phrase, "You didn't build that." If you don't remember, and it sounds like you all do, President Obama said in a 2012 campaign speech that he believed in government programs to redistribute wealth because successful people ought to give back to the community. Quote, "If you've been successful, you didn't get there on your own. I'm always struck by people who think, well, it must be because I worked harder than everybody else. Let me tell you something. There are a whole bunch of hardworking people out there. If you were successful, somebody along the line gave you help. Somebody helped create this unbelievable American system that we have that allowed you to thrive. Somebody invested in roads and bridges. If you've got a business, you didn't build that. Somebody else made that happen." End quote. Now, the implication here is clear, because every person's success is somehow or another influenced by what he or she receives from others. He or she, therefore, has a moral duty to surrender part of his or her gains to another person in a mutually reinforcing system of unchosen commitments. Now, there's a dangerous, superficial plausibility to this argument, one that can seduce us into a false and wicked moral conclusion. It's true, of course, that there is a way in which one can have a presumptive moral obligation to repay investments that others have made in our lives, even if we didn't ask for the help. We lawyers call it quantum merit, but there's a simpler and more obvious example: parents and children. When Ayn Rand was asked what obligation children owe to their aging parents, she answered that they do have a presumptive obligation to help their parents to some degree because their parents cared for them when they were young and helpless. But that's very different from the proposition that a child perpetually owes his or her life to the service of a parent, that he or she must obey a parent's will indefinitely. Where do we draw the line between what a parent may properly demand and what the child has no obligation to do? That depends on the case. A child who was abused or neglected may owe no obligation, whereas a child whose parents assiduously cared for him or her and fostered his living in a good life may owe a good deal. But it is never the case that a child belongs to a parent, or that a parent may make a constant series of demands on the child even after maturity. At some point, the child grows up and his or her life belongs to him or herself, and all conscientious parents want this. Likewise, it's a fallacy to start with the proposition that because some investor helped start a small business or government programs subsidized an industry, that somebody else made that happen, and each of us owes or lives in an unbreakable web of unchosen obligation where we must acknowledge ourselves as having not built that and where we owe others the fruits of our labors. The fallacy here is in conflating a healthy conception of equality, which focuses on independence, strength, and ability, and which has room for the appreciation of help from or to others, with the unhealthy conception of equality, one that's rooted in envy and resentment, and which views everyone as the servant of everyone else. Obviously, Douglass did not believe that he owed others the fruits of his labors as a result of their unchosen obligations that they thrust upon him. Consider his life in Baltimore as a teenager with his master Hugh Auld, the brother of his owner, Thomas Auld. Now, there's certainly a sense in which Hugh Auld aided Douglass in the 1830s. Douglass lived in his home. He was fed with his money. Master Hugh even allowed him to obtain employment in the shipyards and hire himself on special jobs, and even to keep some of his earnings. All of this helped Douglass to save up money, and Auld had no legal obligation to do any of these things. In a sense, they helped Douglass escape, since he used his savings to buy the forged documents that got him on the Underground Railroad. But Douglass would have vehemently rejected the idea that because the Auld family did things that helped him, he therefore owed them a duty to sacrifice himself for their sake. In fact, Douglass did reject that idea in his speeches and writings as an abolitionist. In his famous Letter to My Old Master, he wrote, "I am myself, you are yourself. We are two distinct persons. You are a man, and so am I. I am not by nature bound to you, or you to me. I must breathe for myself, and you for yourself. We are each equally provided with faculties necessary to our individual existence. In leaving you, I took nothing but what belonged to me." It is, of course, insulting in the extreme to liken slavery to the relationship between parents and children. But that's exactly what pro-slavery thinkers did in the 19th century. They claimed that slaves were like children and masters were like parents, caring for and protecting their childlike charges. The reason that claim was so absurd is that a parent, a good and honest parent anyway, benefits a child in hopes that the child will flourish and succeed on his own and grow to maturity and freedom. The loving, good, honest parent recognizes that a child's condition is temporary and that the parent does not own the child and has no right to claim the child's life and earnings and labors as his or her own. The slave master, by contrast, views the slave as belonging to him and imagines that he has an indefinite right to the life, liberty, and property of another person. A true parent looks forward to the day when his son or daughter will live independently and realize the gift of life on his or her own. Contrast that with the argument that says that because you've received some benefit, which you had no real opportunity to refuse, and that you therefore owe your achievements to others, and that you should not take pride in it or imagine that you've accomplished it, and that you have a similarly unchosen duty to surrender the gains of your hard work to others, which will then inflict upon the next generation the same unchosen duty that you labor under. That's the perverse notion of family that we call tribalism, one that downplays the individual's part in any achievement and exaggerates the role that the group played as a means of implying that your life is not your own, and that you are first a tool to be used by others and then a device whereby others are used. This was the idea that Frederick Douglass rejected when he escaped from the system of unchosen obligations called slavery and set forth to make his own life. Now, if unchosen obligations of the you didn't build that variety are unhealthy, what did Douglass think was a healthy relationship to our fellow man? I've said that Douglass's Self-Made Men lecture speaks of a healthy version of equality that is rooted in ability and respect, as opposed to the unhealthy version of equality rooted in mutual dependence and need, an equality of pity or of envy in which people resent those who rise above and are impelled to sacrifice for those below. And we've seen how things like military service, which are usually spoken of in terms of self-sacrifice or subordination to others' needs, were to Douglass a means of self-assertion, of the pride of taking responsibility for one's own future, of work, 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 work. Was celebrated is an ideal rooted in self-respect. The recognition of the value of others results from that self-respect. It is an overflowing of spirit. The unhealthy way of looking at others as our equals is to say that each of us is a flawed creature in need of help, and that others are just as weak and incapable as we are. This unhealthy equality tends to lead us to resent those who are stronger or more capable. The healthy form of equality says that each person has the potential for greatness, and it enables us to enjoy witnessing ability in others. And that's the principle that enables the individualist to have a healthy relationship with other people. This point was made particularly well by the philosopher John McMurray, who wrote, "Human freedom demands not merely free people, but the relationship of free people. Its final basis lies in real friendship, the real friendship of one person with another independently real person." McMurray argued that the basis of freedom is personal equality, but equality of a particular type, called an effective mutuality of experience. This is a relationship that's fundamentally the opposite of a power relationship. Where one man seeks power over others, McMurray wrote, the denial of equality involved creates constraint and limits freedom, which destroys the possibility of genuine friendship. Instead, true friendship is an end in itself, one in which the parties derive enjoyment without power, by the appreciation of one another. In other words, free people can be genuine friends because they see each other as genuinely independent beings, not as predators or prey, but as equally capable and equally responsible. A good term for this feeling is mutual esteem. It was because, I think you used the term character friend. That's another good term, character friend, mutual esteem. That's that quality of appreciating another person's independent realness as opposed to seeing them as a potential threat or as an object of our charity. It was because slavery was a power relationship, one that denied that slaves were independently real people, that slavery stood as such a devastating obstacle to mutual esteem, and therefore to love or affection. Slave owners constantly tried to describe slavery as a kind of family relationship, but it was qualitatively and irreconcilably different from a family relationship because it was based on power. So mutual esteem is a result, not a cause of self-esteem, and it stands in notable contrast to the sense of shame that pervades a slave society. In American history, this has been obscured sometimes by slavery's racial component, but always and everywhere, shame has been an inescapable part of slavery. To be enslaved, of course, is to have one's dignity attacked systematically and persistently, with the goal of rendering the slave an automaton beneath the notice of a free person. Even in the pre-Civil War South, everything associated with slavery was viewed as impure. And the reason for this was that slave owners could not escape their own conscience. Deep down inside, they knew that slavery was not merely evil, but degrading, and not just to the slave, but also to the master, for it rendered him not a man, but a tyrant, not a citizen, but an owner. And that placed him outside of the bounds of relationships of equal individuals of mutual esteem, and instead into a power relationship, a relationship of domination governed by terror. A society rooted in unhealthy equality is pervaded by shame and obsessed with power, with the mutual sacrifices that every person makes to every other person. A free society, rooted in a healthy equality, views each person as an end in himself, sees pride as a virtue, not a threat, and is pervaded by a sense of esteem between people who have earned their keep and know it. As Douglass said in Self-Made Men, such a society focuses on the future more than the past, and its mottos are look ahead, go ahead. Our moral atmosphere is full of the inspiration of hope and courage, end quote. But Douglass expressed this idea in a subtler way in his letter to his master. There, he compared his own life as a free man working for his own wages and supporting his wife and children with the life of Thomas Auld. I can boast of as comfortable a dwelling as your own, he wrote. I have an industrious and neat wife and 4 dear children. The 3 oldest are now going regularly to school. 2 can read and write, and the other can spell with tolerable correctness. Dear fellows, they are all in comfortable beds and are sound asleep, perfectly secure under my own roof. He went on to reflect how Auld had a daughter about the same age as little Annie Douglass. And one thinks here of the way parents will sometimes share photos of their children with one another. In this passage, we see a brief glimpse of Douglass's pride in his family, a pride that in a better world could have led to a relationship of mutual esteem with Thomas Auld. But because of slavery's perversion, it was instead a world governed by power and abuse. Now, I have been arguing so far that Douglass's philosophy of self-making begins first with the assertion of ability, which leads secondly to achieving the status that John McMurray calls an independently real person. And third, only once we have that status are we capable of mutual esteem, as contrasted with the perverse relationship of subordination and power that marked slavery and other kinds of abusive relationships. This, I would contend, is what Ayn Rand means when she says, to say I love you, one must first be able to say I. Now, I mention love because Douglass made this point in practice in his personal life. Among the most important ways in which each of us shares and defines and creates a self, or ought to, is in the expression of love. And here, too, Douglass stands as a notable lesson. Douglass married for a second time in January 1884. His wife had died 2 years earlier. This time to a white woman named Helen Pitts. Helen was from an abolitionist family and had worked in schools for freed slaves in the South until she became too ill to continue in that work. And of course, their marriage was scandalous. Interracial marriage was, of course, as shocking then as same-sex marriage was just recently. In fact, Helen's own father disowned her. And Douglass's own grown children from his first marriage were outraged and would have little to do with Helen. Douglass was ridiculed and condemned in the press by both black and white writers. Yet he was undeterred. Choosing a wife was just another way, a particularly beautiful and gentle way, in which the self-made man expresses his values in his relationships with other people. Now, I keep saying his, and I have spoken explicitly in masculine terms, because, of course, Douglass was a man, and sometimes he has been criticized for expressing himself in terms that seem to exclude women from his concept of self-making, but nothing could be further from the truth. Douglass was a lifelong feminist, an advocate of female suffrage. In fact, he argued for the women's right to vote literally until the day he died, within a few hours of having given a speech in favor of women's right to vote. He even attended the famous Seneca Falls Convention. He made a point of emphasizing that slavery was harder on women than on men, and he idealized women such as the slave woman named Nellie, whom he witnessed being beaten on a plantation when he was a little boy. Nellie was a mother of 5, and she had been deemed impudent by the overseer, who dragged her to a tree, tied her to it, and beat her bloody. Throughout the ordeal, she resisted and cursed at him without pause. She was whipped, Douglass wrote, but not subdued, for she continued to denounce the overseer and call him every vile name. He had bruised her flesh, but he had left her invincible spirit undaunted. Such floggings are seldom repeated by the same overseer. They prefer to whip those who are most easily whipped, end quote. In Douglass's eyes, those who stood up for themselves and were punished for it suffered a less deplorable fate than the living and lingering death to which cowardly and slavish souls are subjected. Douglass emphasized the willingness to stand up for oneself in strong terms because, of course, his audiences were usually not accustomed to being free to do so. But he also believed in the gentler qualities that constituted self-making. He was a loving and open man, open with his affections, particularly toward his grandchildren, who loved to sit on his knee while he played the violin and braid his hair. An amusing story is told of a VIP coming to his house and knocking on the door, and the whole family had to scramble into his bedroom to undo the braids that his granddaughter had done to his hair. He understood that we should praise the good at least as strongly as we condemn the bad. And he strove to command himself, to carry himself with calm dignity, even in adverse situations. One of my favorite stories, on one of his visits to the White House, to meet with Abraham Lincoln, Douglass was forced to wait in a room while Lincoln was finishing up a meeting. And another man approached Douglass and in that casual racist way of the time said to him, "Are you the president?" And Douglass simply looked at him and said, "I am Frederick Douglass." In this little tale, we get a sense of the essential man. His cool dignity could be asserted simply as a fact without any need for pretense or exaggeration. It was enough that he was who he was. He had asserted his abilities, attained the status of an independently real person, and was then capable of the serene kind of pride that marks a citizen in a society of healthy equality, one pervaded not by envy, but by admiration, not by resentment, but by a benevolent mutual esteem toward those we respect. Now, I want to end with a word about autobiography. Douglass wrote 3 versions of his memoirs. It's clear it was not just an act of historical record-keeping. It was something akin to the picture-making that he celebrated in his lectures on photography. It was a way of taking account of his life. In her book, The Morality of Happiness, the philosopher Julia Annis notes that ancient philosophers such as Aristotle do not employ the same sort of hierarchical approach to duties and ethical dilemmas that modern philosophers use. Instead, they begin with a person who, having already lived for a while, pauses to reflect on his life and ask whether it is as it should be or whether it can be improved. And this kind of ethical philosophy begins with, in her words, stepping back from particular concerns to a reflection on one's life as a whole. It aims to turn our actions toward the rational good, the flourishing, fulfilled life, which we accomplish by acting in ways that reflect the moral quality of one's life as a whole. Writing an autobiography, I would suggest, reflects this sort of attitude toward looking at the arc of one's life, of accounting for one's past and aiming towards one's future in a way that makes sense of a comprehensive, well-lived life. And the tool that we use to accomplish this is conscience. Douglass wrote a great deal about the conscience, which he defined as the pillar of moral rectitude. Conscience is that inner compass that tells us when we're acting rightly or wrongly, an interior dialogue with the self that judges the self in the same way that we judge or ought to judge others. Many people imagine it as something standing outside of us, like Jiminy Cricket in Pinocchio, that keeps an eye on our actions. And one of Douglass's most scathing indictments of slavery was that it obliterated conscience. And the reason was that without conscience, the slave would be deprived of the moral landmarks by which to judge his own conduct or that of the master. And that would allow the master to claim that he was the source of all moral rectitude and that the slave should shut up and obey. The self-made man, by contrast, who asserts his ability and becomes an independently real person, cannot outsource the functions of conscience. On the contrary, he seeks to bolster his conscience and exercise it more vigorously over his actions so that the story of his life as a whole will be a comprehensive, focused, and rewarding one. In taking charge of his own autobiography, Douglass was doing what he said in his photography lecture was the essential human activity: conscious self-reflection and the projection of one's abstract ideals into the visible world. It was an act of conscience. This process also has a great reward. It has often been said, and rightly, that the key to happiness is gratitude, cultivating a sense of appreciation for the good in our lives, which it is sometimes easy to overlook. In writing his memoir and reflecting on the great things he had experienced and witnessed, Douglass was able to take scope of the good as well as of the adversity and appreciate its fullness. Contemplating my life as a whole, he wrote in the last paragraph of the book, I have to say that although it has at times been dark and stormy, and I have met with hardships from time to time from which other men have been exempted, yet my life has in many respects been remarkably full of sunshine and joy. That feeling of fulfillment was the reward that he had achieved by making a self, a goal for which he had to work. As he said at the end of Self-Made Men, if by statement, argument, sentiment, or example, I have awakened in any of you the sense of the value of manhood, or have stirred in any of you a courageous resolution to make one more effort towards self-improvement and higher usefulness, I have not spoken in vain. Thank you. Be happy to answer any questions you have.
Hi.
Howdy.
Testing. Okay. Frederick Douglass, in his speeches after the Civil War, had to address the question of what to do with the Negro. And I remember reading his speeches. He said, do nothing.
That's right.
Just don't get in our way.
Right.
What happened to that message? Because we know we did get in, well, we got in their way with the Jim Crow laws, but
right.
We also got in their way, we created.
So, yeah.
Okay, I'll leave it to you.
What happened to the message of do nothing with us could fill volumes of American history, of which I'm sorry to say most white Americans are completely ignorant. Douglass did give this famous speech called What the Black Man Wants, in which he said, we have been asked, we abolitionists, what shall we do with the slaves if they are emancipated? And my answer is, do nothing with us. Your doing has caused all the trouble with us. And in one particularly interesting line in the speech, he says, if the apples are disposed to ripen early and to fall too soon, I am not for artificially wiring them onto the tree in any way. And if the Negro cannot stand on his own two legs, it will be his fault who made the Negro, not your fault. But if you will untie his hands, I believe he will live. And of course, I'm paraphrasing, Douglass is far more eloquent than I, but he went on later on to explain what he meant by that was do justice. Not do nothing, but do justice. Protect their civil rights as promised by the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Stop discriminating against them arbitrarily through Jim Crow laws and other kinds of segregation practices, not just in the South, but in the North. So what he meant by do nothing with us is what we would regard as the classical liberal state, one that protects individual rights and leaves them otherwise alone. However, toward the end of his life in the 1890s, the Southern reinstitution of slavery was well underway. Douglass died a year before Plessy versus Ferguson. And what he was witnessing was the reinstitution of slavery, sometimes in informal ways through, for example, crop sharing or and these were or the payment of workers with coupons redeemable on stores instead of with cash. The passage of peonage laws that prohibited black workers from leaving their jobs. Or just arbitrary arrests, and then you'd be sent to prisons like Parchman Farm, and then you'd be surprised working on a slave plantation again. So Douglass was very realistic about the fact that what was going on was an abuse. And I think one of the reasons why I've been criticized and others have been criticized for emphasizing the do nothing with us speech is because the left sort of thinks that means throw the former slaves to the wolves. And of course, that's not what Douglass or what modern day libertarians or objectivists would hold. But that's the short answer. Let me go on to say, Douglass's successor, if there is such a thing, as a leader of the black race was Booker T. Washington, who's very famous for the self-reliance message, although he gets a really bad rap in today's world because he was an anti-segregation activist. Those of you interested in Washington, I would recommend a marvelous biography of him called Up From, oh gosh, it's not Up From Slavery, it's a play on that. Robert Norrell is the name of the author. Up From History, that's what it's called. Marvelous biography of Washington. And then, of course, the feud between Washington and Du Bois broke out in around 1900 or so. And one side is Washington saying, we have to concentrate on basic industrial education, building a black working class that can support a black intellectual leadership later on to fight for civil rights. And Du Bois says, no, what we need is an intellectual vanguard that will emphasize political reform primarily, and then the other things will follow. It's the most interesting intellectual debate of the 20th century, and I don't pretend that one side or the other was absolutely right or wrong in that debate. Anybody who takes one side or the other is giving you short shrift on the complexities of what was going on in the early 20th century. What happened to Douglass's legacy? Douglass is fortunate in the sense that he died before Plessy, because that means that he kind of hovers over the rest of American history like the blimp at the Super Bowl, and each team can cheer for him. So he's lucky in that sense to have escaped. In today's world, he would have very much admired Martin Luther King's reassertion of the immorality of segregation. That was the greatest achievement of Martin Luther King as an activist. He would have emphasized that. He would, of course, loved King's eloquence, but he would have passionately opposed the nonviolent ideology. He would have admired Malcolm for his willingness to defend oneself with violence, but he would passionately have opposed the racial separationism, which is one of the great bêtes noires of Douglass's life. His entire career was devoted to the opposite of separating the two races, whether it be through slavery or colonization schemes, which were proposed both by pro-slavery and even by former slaves themselves, argued, look, there's no future for us in this country. We need to emigrate to Haiti or Africa or something like that. And Douglass was passionately opposed to that throughout his life. He said, all this native land talk is nonsense. The native land of the American Negro is America. And he was very intense on that point. So there is no simple answer to what happened to Douglass's work, self-reliance message. It got, unfortunately, derailed by the fact that Southern racism found ways, both through the law or through informal practice, to deprive the freed black people of the fruits of their labors and to reinstitute slavery for another century after the end of the war. Yes?
Thank you for the lecture. So his experiences, they were so unimaginable to me and unthinkable. I haven't read his works, and I can't imagine for psychological therapy to be so prevalent in that era. How did he get over everything that transpired from his time in slavery?
Well, it's an interesting question because, like you said, there wasn't such a thing as organized psychology in his day. Douglass found, I think we can only speculate about this, right? How did Douglass deal with the psychological scars of slavery, and of course the literal scars that he carried on his back? I think that the easy answer is that he found the best way to deal with that bitter energy was to transform it into positive energy by working with it, to devote all of that to the task of reform. One of my favorite quotations from Thomas Jefferson is, the key to happiness is to keep oneself always occupied. The idle alone are the only wretched. And Douglass was anything but idle. When he died, he was learning German and on his own. So I think that's the cleanest answer, but I suspect that he never totally got over it. However, there was another thing. He did seek reconciliation in certain ways. In the 1870s, he went and visited Thomas Auld on his deathbed. And he also visited the home plantation on which he was born, and he met the daughter, the Auld's daughter, and I think their grandson. And he tried really hard to find reconciliation there and say, look, the crimes of your ancestors are not your crimes, just as as what happened to my ancestors are not my fault. So, he really wanted to find a way of having a clean slate. And of course it was not possible, but it's an admirable direction that he tried to go in. Yes, sir.
What would Frederick Douglass's assessment be of Lyndon B. Johnson?
What would Douglass have thought of Johnson? Well, we know what Douglass thought of the Johnson that he knew. Andrew Johnson, the alcoholic racist who is probably, present company accepted, the worst president in the history of the country. Johnson was drunk at Lincoln's second inaugural, and Douglass was present and saw him drunk and said to a friend, "That man is no friend of our race," and he was right about that. When he met Johnson in the Oval Office, well, not the Oval Office, they didn't have the Oval Office then. When he met Johnson in the White House, Johnson called him a nigger. And you can see the huge breach between that and what had gone before with his friendly meeting with Abraham Lincoln and the beginning of the backslide into the reinstitution of slavery in the South. It's a tragic and horrifying story. What he would have thought of Lyndon Johnson and the idea of the regulatory welfare state, I think Douglass very firmly would have been opposed to the regulatory welfare state. Douglass stands in the line of intellectual dissent that includes people like Thomas Sowell and Clarence Thomas and Booker T. Washington, and he would have been appalled by the welfare state and bureaucracy that hinders entrepreneurship and self-reliance. At the same time, he would have been far more horrified by the unconstitutional, unwinnable, immoral war on drugs that has deprived so many of our fellow citizens of their lives, their liberties, and their fortunes for absolutely no justifiable reason. Yes, sir.
Quick question. You mentioned Thomas Jefferson just a while ago. And did Frederick Douglass write or mention or talk about the fact that Thomas Jefferson was a slave owner?
He did, and I wish that I had all day to talk about Douglass, because my more interesting lecture is Douglass and the Constitution. Douglass was a fascinating constitutional scholar, and he believed that the Constitution, quote, interpreted as it ought to be interpreted, is a glorious liberty document, end quote. And in a speech, one of his most famous, called "What to the Slave is the 4th of July," he quoted Jefferson and other founding fathers at length for their hatred of slavery. And Douglass emphasized that, yes, of course, Jefferson had slaves, but Jefferson was opposed to slavery, and what's important about Douglass's legacy is that every society in the world has had slavery. Slavery is among the oldest human institutions that exist. By comparison to slavery, literacy and monogamy are just fads. What's unique and different about America is the pledge that all men are created equal, and that's what Douglass emphasized. I want to pause and reiterate this point, because today, I'm sorry to see the rise of a leadership class on the left, among blacks on the left, of a group of people who insist that America is fundamentally a white supremacist nation, and that, in the words of the worst of these, Ta-Nehisi Coates, who is essentially the anti-Frederick Douglass, that the soul of America is plunder of black bodies, is his term for that. Douglass would have said, of course that's not true. The soul of America is the idea that all men are created equal. And the reason why slavery was so horrible was because it violated that premise. Coates claims that America is unimaginable without slavery, which is absurd. America is easily imaginable without slavery, and hundreds of good people, black and white, imagined it without slavery in the decades that led to the Civil War, and hundreds of thousands of them died for the sake of an America without slavery because they imagined it. And they have since then worked through the civil rights movement and to this very day, putting their lives on the line because they imagined an America without slavery. What America is unimaginable without is the Declaration of Independence and the principle that all men are created equal. Every country has rocks and trees and beautiful waterfalls and a whole bunch of people living their lives. Every country in the world has that. What America has that's unique and that America is unimaginable without is the principle of equality at the heart of the Declaration of Independence and the fruits of that blessed tree. Yes, one last question.
William Lloyd Garrison was a famous abolitionist. Did Douglass know him? Did he
Yes.
meet him? And if so, what did he think of him?
So this is my second lecture, the one on the Constitution. So as I got my 5 minutes. So Douglass escaped from slavery in 1838, since he met William Lloyd Garrison, who was the most famous abolitionist of the time, publisher of The Liberator. And Garrison recruited Douglass into the abolition movement. Douglass gave a halting and nervous one of his first public speeches at an abolitionist convention, and Garrison was so impressed by it that he stood up and extemporized a speech about Douglass in front of the audience. And he said, "Is this a man that we will be sending back to slavery from the soil of old Massachusetts?" And the audience shouted, "No!" And that was Douglass's entry into the world, into his career as an abolitionist. And for almost a decade, Douglass spent time as Garrison's protege. But in around 1845 or so, things started to change. Douglass took a trip to Britain, and while there, he was sort of persuaded that Garrison's hatred of the U.S. Constitution was misguided. Garrison believed the Constitution was an evil document because it compromised with slavery, and he would burn it at his July 4th speeches and demanded that to end slavery, the entire United States should be abolished. And Douglass was persuaded in around 1847 or 1850 to abandon that idea, and he embraced instead the idea that the Constitution was fundamentally an anti-slavery document that gave the federal government power to limit or even abolish slavery if politicians were willing to do so. And that split with Garrison, that was the end of his relationship with Garrison. I mean, not long afterwards, Garrison said some really nasty things about Douglass's personal life, and it's possible that they certainly never met on friendly terms after that. They may have met at a few conventions and things, but that was the end of their personal relationship. And that dichotomy between Douglass and Garrison persists to this day within the libertarian free market movement. Generally, there are those who insist that to lend your hand to the political system by voting or participating, you are lending your credence to the corrupt system, and that the only true solution is to step back and refuse to have nothing to do with it. And that was Garrison's position. And Douglass's position was that that is an abandonment of moral responsibility that prioritizes the cleanliness of your own hands over the task of actually accomplishing anything. He said of Garrison that the anti-slavery movement started out to free the slave, and under Garrison's leadership, it would leave the slave to free himself. That Garrison, by refusing to engage in politics, what he was doing was, Douglass said that if I've been on a pirate ship and I have raped and robbed and plundered, I can't absolve myself of the sin by jumping into the lifeboat and shouting, "No more union with slaveholders, no more union with pirates," right? But that was what Garrison was doing, because no union with slaveholders is not accomplishing his moral responsibility. Of course, Garrison's position was, yeah, sure, watch Douglass. He's going to go through politics and he's going to end up compromising his principles. And there are many occasions on which that exact thing did happen. So it's kind of a morality play to see Garrison and Douglass as two opposite sides of the question of what do you do about such a colossal evil as slavery? Do you engage in politics and try and ameliorate the problem, knowing that by doing so you are going to have to compromise with people and that you are lending your moral credibility to the system? Or do you say, no, I'm just going to have nothing to do with it. It's going to be, revolution or nothing. Isn't that making the best the enemy of the good, as they say? It's another one of those great moral dilemmas that's really pervasive throughout history. Thank you all.